Under the relentless sun of Arizona, Amos Harlan rode with a measured gait, his bay gelding kicking up faint clouds of dust with each deliberate step. He'd been tracking a stray calf for nearly a day, following hoofprints that faded into the cracked, sun-scorched earth. The silence of the desert was a sacred thing, broken only by the creak of his saddle, the low moan of wind through mesquite, and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk. Amos preferred it this way, solitary, quiet, predictable. At 52, he'd long since made peace with the emptiness of his days, finding comfort in the rhythm of a life unburdened by others. But then he heard a sound so faint it might have been the wind curling around a rock. It was a gasp, fragile and sharp, like a thread stretched to breaking. Amos reined in his horse, his weathered hand tightening on the leather. His heart slowed as he tilted his head, listening. There it was again, a whimper, raw and fleeting. He swung down from the saddle, tying the reins to a gnarled juniper, and slung his rifle over his shoulder. His boots crunched softly as he moved through the scrub, past jagged boulders and brittle sagebrush, until he reached a clearing fringed by ancient sycamores. And there, beneath the tallest tree, he saw her. She hung by her wrists, ropes biting into her skin, her body limp like a marionette with cut strings. Her bare feet barely grazed the dirt, and her skin was sun-darkened, streaked with dust and sweat. Long black hair clung to her face, matted with blood. Her chest rose in shallow, uneven breath. She was alive, but only just. Amos's eyes flicked to the rough wooden sign nailed above her head. The words were scrawled in crude black paint, jagged and hateful. "White man don't forget." He staggered back, his throat tightening as if the air itself had turned to ash. The sign's message hung like a curse, a warning etched in venom. His gaze swept the horizon ridges, rocks, the endless stretch of desert. Nothing moved, no sound but the wind hissing through dry leaves. His hand found the knife at his belt, fingers brushing the worn handle. "God Almighty," he muttered, his voice rough as gravel. "What in hell did they do to you?" The girl stirred, her head lolling forward. Amos saw the raw, red marks where the rope had burned into her wrists. "You hear me?" he called, his voice low but firm. No response. "I ain't here to hurt you," he said, softer now, almost to himself. He stepped closer, his boots stirring the dust. Her face came into view, young, maybe 19, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. Her lips were cracked, blood dried in a thin line at the corner. Her eyes were closed, but her breath hitched, faint and desperate. Amos reached for the rope, his fingers trembling as he traced its coarse fibers. It was hemp, old and brittle, tied with cruel precision to prolong her suffering. The sign loomed above, its words screaming accusations he didn't understand, but felt in his bones. He'd seen hate before, had buried its consequence, but this was something darker, something that made his chest ache with a guilt he couldn't name. "I ain't them," he whispered, sliding his knife under the rope. "I ain't that." With a single, steady cut, the rope snapped. She collapsed forward, and Amos caught her, her body light and fever-hot in his arms. Her eyes fluttered open dark, wild, unfocused, bore closing again. He knelt, easing her to the ground, one knee sinking into the dirt. Fumbling for his canteen, he soaked a rag and pressed it to her lips. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're safe. For now." She blinked, her hand twitching toward his sleeve, clutching weakly. Amos glanced at the sign one last time, its words searing into his mind. He pulled off his duster and draped it over her shoulders, the fabric swallowing her slight frame. "You got a name?" he asked gently. No answer. "Reckon we'll find one," he said, more to himself. He lifted her, cradling her as if she were made of glass, and carried her back to his horse. The desert stretched endless around them, but for the first time in years, Amos felt the weight of something heavier than solitude. By dusk, he reached his Ronca, modest spread clinging to the edge of a valley too stubborn to yield to the desert's grip. A lone windmill groaned in the breeze, and the barn leaned like it carried the weight of old sorrows. The house was simple, one room with a loft, its tin roof patched but sturdy. Amos carried the girl inside, her fevered head resting against his chest, her breath shallow and uneven. He laid her on the cot, unwrapping the duster with care. Her eyes opened briefly, wide and wary, but they held his gaze before drifting shut. He lit a lantern, its flicker casting shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Filling a basin with water, he knelt beside her, noting the bruises on her legs, the swollen ankle. The rope burns like brands on her wrists. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, breaking the silence. "Just cleaning you up." He dipped a cloth in the warm water, wrung it out, and gently lifted her foot into the basin. She flinched, a faint tremor, but didn't pull away. He waited, then began to wash the dust and blood from her skin, his touch deliberate, almost reverent. The water darkened, swirling red and brown. Amos worked in silence, feeling her gaze on him sharp, uncertain, like a blade half-drawn. Her lips parted once, but no sound came. "Reckon you don't talk much," he said, not unkindly. "That's fine. Silence beats most things out here." He finished her feet, wrapping them in clean cloth, and set them on a folded blanket. "You remind me of a creek I used to fish in," he said, his voice soft. "Dry most times, but when the rains came, it ran fierce. Locals called it Stillwater. Suits you." He studied her in the lamplight, sharp cheekbones, full lips cracked from thirst, dark lashes heavy with dust. She was young, too young for this kind of pain, but her eyes held something ancient, something that didn't bend under suffering. "I'll call you Mara," he said, "just for now." Quiet but deep, like that creek. She blinked slowly, no protest, just breath. Amos tucked a blanket around her, then grabbed his bedroll and headed for the door. He'd sleep in the barn tonight, give her space. A man with his past didn't belong too close to something so fragile. Before stepping out, he looked back. She'd shifted, eyes closed, lips still. The basin sat beside the cot, its water stained with her pain. He emptied it outside, watching the liquid vanish into the thirsty earth. Inside, she slept, or tried to, dreaming of fire, of ropes, and of hands that washed away the hurt without asking for anything in return. The days that followed settled into a cautious rhythm. Mara ate sparingly when Amos brought food beans, cornbread, sometimes dried fruit. She moved like a shadow, eyes always scanning, her posture taut as if expecting a trap. She never spoke, but Amos caught her watching him, studying his movements when she thought he wasn't looking. At night, he left her the cot and slept in the barn, his rifle close. He told himself it was for her comfort, but the truth was murkier. That sign-white man don't forget burned in his mind, a warning of trouble that might still be coming. On the third morning, he found a boot print in the dirt near the corral. It was smaller than his, the tread sharp and fresh, no more than a few hours old. Amos crouched, tracing the heel cavalry issue, military. His eyes scanned the ridge beyond the fence, nothing but heat shimmer and sage. Inside, Mara sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, her body stiffening as he entered. "You seen anyone?" he asked. She didn't answer, only pulled the blanket tighter. "Think we've got company," Amos muttered, more to himself. That night, he kept the lantern dim and sat on the porch, rifle across his knees. The wind had stilled, and coyotes yipped in the distance. Stars blinked awake, cold and indifferent. Inside, Mara paced, her footsteps soft but restless. By noon the next day, a rider appeared, dust trailing behind a roan horse. The man wore a cavalry uniform, his hat low, his face rough with stubble. Amos stepped off the porch, one hand resting on his belt. "Harlan," the rider called, reining in. "Lieutenant Wade, Fort Cimarron. We're tracking a fugitive." He pulled a folded notice from his pocket and handed it down. Amos unfolded it, already suspecting what it held, a sketch of a young Navajo girl, sharp-eyed, long-haired. The text read, "Wanted for theft and assault. Dangerous. Reward $75. Amos met the lieutenant's gaze. "Ain't seen her." "You sure?" Wade leaned forward. "Young, quiet. Might be hurt hiding. We think someone took her near Sycamore Wash." Amos handed the paper back. "Just me and the livestock out here." Wade's eyes narrowed. "She's no innocent, Harlan. Part of a band that's been raiding. That sign they left it means trouble." Amos's jaw tightened. "I see anything, I'll send word." Wade studied him, then nodded and rode off. Inside, Mara stood behind the curtain, her face unreadable. She'd heard every word. Amos hung his hat by the door. "They're looking for you," he said. "Showed me a paper. Said you're wanted." She didn't speak. I told Em no. Her eyes flicked to his, wary, searching. I don't know what you did, Mara, and maybe you'll tell me someday. But out here, a man chooses his path. I chose mine. He turned to the stove, stirring a pot of beans already cooked. Behind him, Mara shifted, her breath softening. Trust, fragile as a spider's thread, began to weave between them. The afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard. Amos sat on the porch, sharpening his knife with slow, rhythmic strokes. The sound of steel on stone echoed faintly, grounding him. He tried not to think of Mara inside, or the sign, or the bootprint that promised trouble. Then he heard footsteps light, hesitant. Mara stepped outside, her bare feet touching the earth as if testing its strength. The blanket hung from her shoulders, trailing like a cloak. She moved toward the corral, her steps uneven but deliberate. Amos set the knife down, watching. She looked smaller in the daylight, but there was a quiet resolve in her gait, as if she were reclaiming something stolen. She knelt by a patch of bare dirt near the barn, where the wind had swept away debris. Picking up a stick, she began to draw. Amos rose, approaching slowly, giving her space. In the dust, she'd etched a deer, its antlers branching wide, surrounded by jagged lines like lightning. The image was bold, alive with tension, as if the deer were caught mid-leap, defying the storm. Amos squatted beside her, his voice low. "What's that?" Mara's hand paused, her eyes fixed on the drawing. For a long moment, she was silent, as if weighing whether to let the words free. Then she spoke, her voice dry and cracked. "Deer in storm. My people's sign." Amos waited, his gaze on the image. She tapped the deer's heart with the stick. "This was my father's. Our family. We carved it on baskets, painted it on hides. Always running, always strong." Her shoulders tightened, her jaw clenching. "They came last winter," she continued, her words halting. "Soldiers, white jackets. Said we had to leave. No water, no game where they wanted us. We said no. We fought," her voice thinned, trembling. "They burned our homes, killed my mother, my brother, left the elders to die in the flames." Amos's fists clenched, a slow anger rising. "I ran. They found me, beat me, tied me, said I stole weapons. I didn't." She turned, her eyes locking onto his, fierce and unyielding. "I didn't steal. I didn't hurt anyone. I did nothing wrong." Her voice rang out, raw and defiant. Amos held her gaze, his own voice steady. "I believe you." Mara dropped the stick, her hands falling to her lap. Her shoulders shook, silent at first, then breaking into sobs that tore through her. She curled forward, hair veiling her face, her pain too vast for her frame. Amos stayed beside her, unmoving. He didn't reach for her, didn't offer hollow words. Instead, he pressed his hand into the dirt beside the deer, palm flat, fingers spread, his skin touching the earth she'd marked with grief. It wasn't comfort, it was witness. Mara's breathing slowed. She lifted her head, her face streaked with tears and dust. Their eyes met, unguarded. "You can call me Mara," she whispered. Amos nodded, his voice rough. "Mara it is." They sat in silence as the sun sank, the deer fading into shadow. That night, the wind howled through the rafters, rattling the walls like a restless spirit. Amos tended a pot of stew by the fire, his sleeves rolled up, his boots off. Mara stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the dessert darken. The silence between them had softened, no longer a barrier, but a shared space. She turned abruptly. "You want the truth?" Amos looked up, his spoon still. He nodded once. She sat across from him, her voice low but clear. "My father led our band. Small, quiet. We traded with ranchers, learned their ways. We wanted peace." Her fingers tightened on the table's edge. "Last fall, a settler was found dead near our camp. Stabbed. His brother blamed us, said we attacked. But it wasn't true. He died because his own kin turned on him. Everyone knew, but they needed someone to punish." Her eyes met Amos's, unflinching. "Soldiers came. Ranchers, too. Men with torches and hate. They burned our camp, shot my brother as he slept. My mother died clutching a cross she'd been given by a missionary. They left my father hanging from a post." Amos's gaze dropped, his jaw tight. "They found me hiding in a ditch. I had a knife for cutting roots, not blood. They called me a thief, a killer. Then they tied me to that tree you found me on, left me for the vultures." She paused, her voice softening. "Why did you cut me down?" Amos looked at her, the fire casting shadows on his weathered face. "Because once," he said. "I didn't." Her brow furrowed. "My wife," he continued, his voice flat. 10 years back, raiders hit our spread. Navajo, they said, but I never knew for sure. I was out checking fences, came back to smoke, heard her screaming in the house. I froze, too scared to move. By the time I got there, she was gone." The silence grew heavy, thick with shared loss. "You saved me because you couldn't save her," Mara said softly. He nodded. She studied him, her eyes searching. "If I'd been white, would you still have cut the rope?" Amos stood, moving around the table until he faced her. He reached out, his calloused hand lifting her chin gently. "I don't see skin," he said. "I see what's alive beneath it." Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. She pressed her cheek into his hand, and they leaned toward each other. The kiss was tentative, then deep, as if they'd both been drowning and found air. Her hands rested on his chest, his arms encircling her. The fire crackled softly, and outside, the wind stilled. In that moment, something broken began to heal. The morning after the kiss, the desert air carried a sharpness that Amos Harlan couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the chill of dawn, it was a feeling, heavy and taut, like the moment before a storm breaks. He stood by the corral, checking the horses, his hands moving through the familiar tasks of tightening cinches and filling feed bags. But his eyes kept drifting to the horizon, where the ridges loomed like silent sentinels. The boot print he'd found days ago lingered in his mind, as did the cavalry lieutenant's visit. Trouble was coming, and it wasn't the kind you could outride. Inside the house, Mara moved with a new ease, her steps lighter but still cautious. She swept the floor, her borrowed dressin of Amos's late wife's, altered with clumsy stitches swishing softly. She'd taken to small tasks around the ranch, feeding the chickens or stacking kindling, as if anchoring herself to the place. Amos caught her humming once, a low, unfamiliar melody that stopped when she noticed him watching. Her silence had softened, but her eyes still carried the weight of someone who'd learned to expect betrayal. By mid-morning, Amos was repairing a fence post when he saw it, a thin column of dust rising from the east, too steady for wind, too deliberate for a stray herd. He dropped the hammer, his pulse quickening, and strode to the porch, grabbing his rifle. Mara appeared at the door, her face tightening as she followed his gaze. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low but firm. She nodded, retreating, but her hand lingered on the doorframe, as if ready to spring. 3 riders approached, their silhouettes sharpening against the haze. They weren't cavalry not this time. These were local men, their canvas coats dusty, their hats worn low. Rifles rested across their saddles, and the leader, a broad man with a tin badge pinned to his chest, rode with the swagger of someone who'd appointed himself judge. Amos recognized him, Silas Boone, a rancher from the next valley, known for his quick temper and quicker trigger. The badge was new, likely self-given, but it carried weight in a land where law was often just the loudest voice. "Harlan," Boone called, reining in his horse 10 yards from the porch. His voice was gravelly, worn by years of shouting orders. "Heard you might be keeping company that don't belong." The other 2 men, younger but hard-eyed, spread out slightly, their hands near their weapons. Amos stepped down from the porch, rifle cradled loosely, his stance calm but unyielding. "You hear a lot, Silas," Amos replied. "Don't make it true." His eyes flicked to the others, noting their restless fingers, the way their horses shifted under tight reins. This wasn't a social call. Boone spat into the dirt, his gaze narrowing. "A Navajo girl, wanted for trouble thieving, maybe worse. There's a reward, $75, and the gratitude of every honest man in the territory." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Word is she was seen near Sycamore Wash, maybe taken in by someone soft-hearted or stupid." Amos's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "You rode all this way for gossip? Must be a slow week." He shifted his weight, letting the rifle's barrel catch the sunlight. A subtle warning, but clear. Boone's smile was thin, humorless. "We aim to look inside, Harlan. Make sure you ain't hiding nothing." He nodded toward the house. and one of the younger men, a weary kid with a scar across his cheek, dismounted, his hand on his pistol. "You got a warrant?" Amos asked, stepping forward to block the path to the door. His tone was steady, but his pulse thrummed. He'd faced down men before, but not with someone else's life hanging in the balance. Boone snorted. "This ain't a courtroom, Amos. Out here, we handle things direct." The second man dismounted now, his boots kicking up dust. The air grew brittle, like glass about to shatter. "I live alone," Amos said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Ain't no girl here. Just me, the horses, and a mule that don't listen." He met Boone's eyes unblinking, daring him to push further. Boone held his gaze, his fingers twitching near his holster. For a long moment, no one moved. Then he nodded, a curt gesture, and waved his men back. "If you're lying, Harlan, you'll answer for it. And it won't be pretty." He turned his horse, the others following. But his parting words carried back, "We'll be watching." Amos stood rooted until the dust settled and the riders vanished over the ridge. Only then did he lower the rifle, his shoulders easing, but not fully relaxing. Inside, Mara stood by the window, her face pale but composed. She'd seen everything, heard every word. Amos hung his hat by the door, avoiding her gaze. "They'll be back," he said, more to himself than to her, "with more men and less patience." Mara stepped closer, her voice soft but steady. "Why didn't you let them search?" Her eyes searched his, probing for something witnessed out. Or maybe just truth. Amos met her gaze, his voice low. "Because I know what men like that do when they find what they're looking for. And I ain't letting that happen." He turned to the stove, busying himself with a pot of coffee. But the weight of her presence lingered. She didn't speak again, but her silence felt different now, not weary, but heavy with something unspoken. That night, Amos sat by the barn, the stars hidden behind a veil of clouds. In his hands was the sign he'd pried from the tree where he'd found Mara, now buried in a sack behind the corral. He'd dug it up after Boone's visit, needing to see it again. "White man don't forget." The words, faded but still legible, seemed to pulse with a life of their own. He traced the letters, his fingers rough against the splintered wood. The hate in them wasn't just for Mara, it was a challenge, a promise of blood to come. He stood, carrying the sign to a small fire pit he'd built away from the house. No words, no ritual. He laid it among the kindling and struck a match. The flames caught slowly, licking at the edges, then surged, swallowing the words in a rush of orange and gold. The wood cracked, curling inward as if resisting its own end. Amos watched, his face unreadable, until the sign was ash. Behind him, footsteps. Mara approached, wearing one of his old coats, the sleeves rolled up. She stopped beside him, her eyes on the fire. The flames reflected in her gaze, flickering with something that looked like grief and something like release. "I should have burned it when I found you," Amos said quietly. She didn't reply, but she stepped closer, her shoulder brushing his. Her fingers clutched the coat, knuckles pale. "Thank you," she whispered, the words simple but weighted, like a prayer offered to the night. Amos looked at her, his chest tight with something he hadn't felt in years, something alive, something dangerous. The fire burned low, embers glowing, and for a moment, the desert seemed to hold its breath. The next morning brought a stillness that felt wrong, like the world was waiting for a spark. Amos rose early, packing a saddlebag with jerky, biscuits, and a spare canteen. The air around the ranch felt watched, the horizon to quiet. He'd seen smoke the night before, faint but steady, not a campfire but a signal. Word was spreading. Time was running out. Mara stood by the fence, her hair braided tightly, the coat draped over her shoulders. Her face was calm, but her eyes asked questions she didn't voice. "We need to move," Amos said, tying the saddlebag to his horse. "Tonight," she nodded, already understanding. "There's land south," he continued, his voice low, "across the border, in the Sierra Peninsula. They say some Navajo still live free there, away from soldiers, away from signs. We can make it if we ride hard." Mara stepped closer, her breath visible in the cool morning air. She reached for his hand, her grip firm. "You'll come with me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amos looked down at her, his throat tight. "I ain't leaving you to face this alone," he said. She pressed her forehead to his chest, her breath warm through his shirt. "I want to stay with you," she said, her words slow, deliberate. As your own. Amos closed his eyes, her words sinking into him like rain into parched earth. He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hairsage and dust and something fiercely alive. Then we'll make it work, he murmured. By sundown, they were ready. 2 horses saddled, the ranch left behind. No note, no fire, just a door left ajar and a home fading into memory. They rode under a sky thick with stars, the moonlight casting the desert in shades of silver. Mara leaned forward in her saddle, her movements sure, practiced. She didn't ask where they were going or what lay ahead. She followed, her trust a quiet force between them. 10 miles from the border, the terrain opened into low scrub and jagged cliffs. Amos scanned the shadows, his gut tightening with every rustle of wind. Trouble had a way of finding you when you least wanted it. The shot came without warning, a sharp crack that split the night. Amos jerked, pain searing through his shoulder as he toppled from the saddle, hitting the dirt hard. Amos, Mara screamed, leaping from her horse. He clutched his shoulder, blood soaking through his shirt, warm and sticky. Go, he rasped, his voice ragged. Ride. No, she said, her voice fierce. Another shot whizzed past, striking a rock nearby. From the ridge line, to figures emerged riders, rifles raised, their silhouettes stark against the moonlit sky. Amos groaned, dragging himself up. We have to move, he said, his vision swimming. Mara hooked her arm under his, pulling him toward a cluster of boulders. Bullets kicked up dust around them, but she didn't flinch. Through sheer will, they stumbled into a narrow pass between 2 cliffs, a hidden gap barely wide enough for a man. Mara half carried him, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The shots faded as the riders hesitated, unwilling to follow into the tight space. Inside the pass, Amos collapsed against the stone, blood dripping onto the dust. His breath came wet, each inhale a struggle. He looked up at Mara, pain and defiance in his eyes. You said you wanted to be mine, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. She knelt beside him, cupping his face, her hands steady despite the fear in her eyes. I meant it, she said. Amos's lips curved, a faint smile through the pain. Then we better make it through this. Mara nodded, her jaw set. She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it to his wound, her hands quick and sure. The riders' voices echoed faintly outside, but the pass was too narrow, too risky for pursuit. For now, they were safe as 2 hunted souls could be. Amos leaned back, his eyes never leaving her. Keep going, he murmured. For both of us. Mara shook her head, her voice fierce. We go together. She bound his wound tighter, her fingers stained with his blood. The night stretched on, cold and unyielding, but in that shadowed pass, something unbreakable took root, a promise forged in dust and fire, stronger than the hate that hunted them. The days that followed were a blur of pain and motion. Mara led them deeper into the desert, following trails only she seemed to know. Amos drifted in and out, his fever rising, then breaking under her care. She found a shallow cave, hidden by mesquite, and built a small fire to keep him warm. She hunted jackrabbits with a sling, boiled roots for broth, and changed his bandages with cloth torn from her own clothes. Her hands, once trembling, now moved with purpose, as if saving him was the only thing keeping her own heart beating. One night, as the fever waned, Amos woke to find her sitting by the fire, her knees drawn up, her eyes on the flames. The cave was small, its walls etched with ancient scratch marks of those who'd hidden here before. He watched her, the firelight carving shadows on her face. Mara, he said, his voice weak but clear. She turned, her expression softening. You're awake, she said, moving to his side. He reached for her hand, his grip frail but warm. Tell me something true, he said, echoing words he'd spoken before. Why do you stay? Her brow furrowed, as if the question surprised her. She looked down, her fingers tightening around his. Because you saw me, she said. Not the sign, not the lies. Me. Amos closed his eyes, her words settling into him like a long-forgotten song. When he opened them, his voice was steady. You're the only thing I've believed in since I lost everything. She didn't cry, but her hand held his tighter, and in that moment, the cave felt less like a hiding place and more like a home. Weeks later, they reached a river valley south of the border. where the land softened into groves of cottonwood and wild grass. The air was cooler here, scented with sage and water. Amos's wound had healed, though the scar would stay, a jagged reminder of the night they'd almost lost everything. They built a small lodge of pine and adobe, simple but sturdy, near the river's bend. Mara still Mara to him, though she'd shared her true name in whispers. One night moved through the space with quiet grace, planting herbs, weaving baskets, humming songs her mother had taught her. Amos worked the land, training a young Mustang and repairing tools. Every so often, he'd glance at the lodge, catching Mara's silhouette through the window, and a warmth would spread through him, unfamiliar but welcome. The lodge held no grand markers of their past, just a few books, a carved wooden spoon, and a blanket Mara was stitching for reasons she hadn't yet shared. It was enough. One evening, Mara walked to the river, her bare feet sinking into the cool shallows. She stood there, hands resting on her belly, a faint curve now visible beneath her dress. Amos approached, his steps soft on the grass. Without a word, their fingers entwined, and they watched the water drift under the twilight. "This place," Mara said softly, "it's ours, not theirs." Amos nodded, his voice low. "We made it." She turned to him, her eyes bright with something fiercer than hope. "We'll keep it," she said. And in her voice, he heard the echo of a promise sent it just to him, but to the life they were building, to the child she carried, to the peace they'd carved from a world that offered none. The river valley where Amos Harlan and Mara had settled was a quiet place, tucked into the folds of the Sierra Peninsula, where the border faded into whispers of mesquite and cottonwood. Their lodge stood humble but strong, its pine and adobe walls weathered by the desert's touch but warmed by the life within. Months had passed since they'd fled Arizona, since the night bullets chased them through the pass. Amos's shoulders still ached when the wind turned cold, but the scar was just that, now a mark, not a wound. Mara, too, had changed. Her steps were surer, her eyes less haunted, though they never lost their sharpness, always scanning the horizon for shadows. By early spring, Mara's belly had rounded noticeably, a gentle curve beneath her woven dresses. She moved through their days with a quiet purpose, tending a small garden of corn and herbs, stitching tiny garments from soft cotton, and humming songs that carried the cadence of her Navajo roots. Amos worked beside her, building a corral for the Mustang he'd tamed, repairing the lodge's roof, and carving a cradle from a fallen cedar. Every glance toward Mara brought a warmth he hadn't known since his first wife, a warmth he'd thought buried with her ashes. But peace, Amos knew, was a fragile thing in a land scarred by hate. The valley felt safe, but safety was an illusion when men with rifles and grudges roamed free. He'd seen no more bootprints, no more dust trails, but the memory of Silas Boone's tin badge and the cavalry lieutenant's wanted poster lingered like a storm cloud on the edge of his mind. Mara felt it too, though she rarely spoke of it. Her hand would pause over her belly sometimes, her lips tightening, as if bracing for a blow that hadn't yet come. One morning, as Amos chopped firewood near the river, he heard hoofbeats distant but steady, too many for a lone rider. He dropped the axe, his pulse quickening, and grabbed his rifle from the lodge. Mara was inside, kneading dough, but she froze when she saw his face. "Stay low," he said, his voice a low growl. She nodded, wiping her hands on her apron, and moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. 5 riders appeared over the ridge, their horses kicking up dust that glowed red in the morning light. Amos recognized Silas Boone at the lead, his badge glinting like a taunt. The others were a mixtuo, locals from Boone's crew, hard men with sun-creased faces. And to strangers in cavalry blue, their uniforms faded but official. Amos stepped onto the porch, rifle cradled, his stance loose but ready. Mara's breath hitched behind him, but she stayed out of sight. "Harlan," Boone called, reining in 20 yards out. His voice carried the smug weight of a man who thought he'd won. "Told you we'd be back." The cavalrymen flanked him, one holding a rolled poster, the other scanning the lodge with narrowed eyes. The locals hung back, rifles resting across their saddles, their fingers itchy. Amos kept his voice even. "You're a long way from home, Silas. What's this about?" He let the rifle's barrel catch the light, a quiet warning. Boone spat into the dirt, his grin cold. No games this time. We know you're hiding that Navajo girl. Got witnesses, no folks saw you riding south with her. She's wanted for theft, assault, maybe murder. Rewards up to $100. He nodded to the cavalryman with the poster, who unrolled it. The sketch was Mara, sharp eyes, long hair, unmistakable. The text was bolder now, accusing her of crimes Amos knew she hadn't committed. Ain't no girl here, Amos said, his tone flat. Just me and the river. You're wasting your time. His eyes flicked to the cavalrymen, noting their stiff postures, the way their hands hovered near their holsters. They weren't here for justice, they were here for blood, or the coin it brought. Boone's grin faded. You're a liar, Harlan, and a fool if you think you can protect a savage. He gestured to the men behind him. We're searching the place. Step aside, or we'll do this the hard way. Amos shifted, planting himself firmer. You step foot on my land without a warrant, and you'll find out how hard it can get. His voice was low, unyielding, but his heart pounded. 5 against 1 wasn't a fight, it was a slaughter. But he'd made a promise to Mara, and he'd die before breaking it. The cavalryman with the poster spoke, his voice clipped. This ain't your call, Harlan. She's a fugitive. Hand her over, and we'll leave peaceful. His hand rested on his pistol, a clear threat. Amos's grip tightened on the rifle. Peaceful ain't your style, soldier. I know what happens to girls like her when you get hold of them. His eyes locked on Boone's. And I know what men like you do when no one's watching. The air grew taut, the silence broken only by the creak of saddles and the restless snort of a horse. Boone's face darkened, his hand inching toward his gun. Last chance, Harlan, he said. Move, or we'll drag you out of the way. Before Amos could answer, a soft creak came from the lodge. Mara stepped onto the porch, her chin high, her eyes blazing. She wore her woven dress, her hair braided tightly, and her hands were empty but steady. I'm here, she said, her voice clear and strong. You want me, come take me. Amos's heart lurched. Mara, get back inside. He hissed, but she didn't move. Her gaze was fixed on Boone, fearless, defiant. The cavalrymen exchanged glances, their hands tightening on their weapons. Boone's grin returned, slow and cruel. Well, now, he said, ain't this convenient? Mara stepped forward, placing herself beside Amos. You call me thief, killer, she said, her voice cutting through the morning air. You lie. I stole nothing. I hurt no one. You burned my home, killed my family, and hung me on a tree to die. If anyone's a murderer, it's you. Boone's grin faltered, his eyes narrowing. Shut your mouth, girl, he snapped. You're coming with us, dead or alive. He drew his pistol, and the others followed suit, their weapons glinting in the sun. Amos raised his rifle, stepping in front of Mara. You'll have to go through me first, he said, his voice a low growl. His shoulder ached, but his aim was steady. 5 against 2 now, but Mara's presence beside him felt like an army. She didn't flinch, her hand brushing his arm, a silent vow to stand with him. The standoff held for a breathless moment, the world shrinking to the space between them. Then a new sound broke the silence, hoofbeats, fast and heavy, coming from the west. All eyes turned as 3 riders crested the ridge, their silhouettes dark against the rising sun. They weren't cavalry or locals. Their clothes were simple, their faces sun-darkened, and their rifles were raised but not yet firing. Amos recognized the Lidera Navajo man he'd traded with years ago, Sella, who'd spoken of a free band living south of the border. Sella reined in, his voice booming across the valley. This is our land, he said, his English clipped but firm. You are not welcome here. His men spread out, their rifles trained on Boone's group. The odds had shifted, and the air crackled with new tension. Boone's face twisted with rage. This ain't your fight, Indian, he spat. Stay out of it, or you'll regret it. Sella's eyes were cold, unyielding. You hunt one of ours. That makes it our fight. He nodded to Mara, a flicker of recognition passing between them. Amos realized that Mara's people, or what was left of them, had found her. Word of their flight must have spread, carried by traders or whispers on the wind. The cavalrymen hesitated, their confidence waning. Boone's grip on his pistol tightened, but he was outnumbered now, and he knew it. This ain't over, Harlan, he said, his voice low and venomous. You and that girl you'll pay. He holstered his gun, gesturing for his men to mount up. They rode off, dust trailing behind them, but their retreat felt like a coiled snake, ready to strike again. Sela dismounted, approaching Amos and Mara. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp but kind. "You are safe here," he said to Mara. "This valley is ours. They will not return easily." He turned to Amos. "You kept her alive. For that, you have our thanks." Amos nodded, lowering his rifle. "She kept herself alive," he said. "I just cut the rope." Mara's hand found his, her grip warm and steady. Sela's gaze softened, and he spoke to Mara in Navajo, his words too soft for Amos to catch. She answered quietly, her voice thick with emotion, and for the first time since Amos had found her. She smiled, a small, fierce thing that lit her face like dawn. The Navajo riders stayed through the day, sharing food and stories around a fire. Mara spoke with them, her words halting at first, then flowing like the river nearby. Amos watched from a distance, giving her space to reconnect with her people. Sela told him of the band's life here, free, but always vigilant, their peace hard-won and fiercely guarded. By nightfall, the riders left, promising to watch the valley's edges. Amos and Mara were alone again, but not as they'd been. They were part of something larger now, a fragile web of trust stretching across the desert. That night, they sat by the lodge's hearth, the fire casting soft shadows on the walls. Mara's hand rested on her belly, her fingers tracing slow circles. Amos watched her, his heart full but heavy. "They could come back," he said quietly. "Boone, the soldiers. Men like that don't let go easy." Mara met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Let them come," she said. "We've faced worse, and we're not alone anymore." She reached for his hand, guiding it to her belly. He felt a faint flutter, the first kick of the life they'd created, and his breath caught. "This is why we fight," she said. "Not for them. For us. For her." Amos nodded, his throat tight. "Her," he repeated, the words settling into him like a vow. They sat in silence, the fire crackling, the river's whisper drifting through the open window. Outside, the valley held its breath, but inside, something unshakable had taken root, a love that had survived fire, bullets, and the weight of a world that tried to break it. Months later, summer bloomed across the valley, painting the grasses gold and the river silver. Mara gave birth in the lodge, attended by a Navajo midwife from Sela's band. The labor was long, but Mara was strong, her cries giving way to the wail of a healthy girl. They named her Najoni, meaning beautiful in Navajo, a name that felt like a promise. Amos held her, his calloused hands gentle, and saw Mara's eyes in her tiny face. His heart ached with a joy he hadn't thought possible. The lodge grew livelier with Najoni's presence. Mara sang to her, weaving stories of deer and storms, of rivers that ran free. Amos built a swing from rope and cedar, hanging it from a cottonwood by the river. He'd push Najoni gently, her giggles echoing through the valley, and Mara would watch, her smile soft but fierce. The Navajo band visited often, bringing gifts of blankets and beads, and Sela taught Amos their ways, a quiet exchange of respect between men who'd chosen to protect what mattered. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Amos and Mara walked to the river, Najoni cradled in Mara's arms. The water shimmered, reflecting the first stars. Mara knelt, dipping her fingers into the current, and whispered to Najoni, "This is your home, little one, where the deer runs, where the storm passes, where love holds." Amos stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, and felt the weight of their journey settle into something solid, something eternal. They'd heard no word of Boone or the cavalry since the standoff, but Amos knew men like that didn't vanish, they festered, waiting for a chance to strike. Yet the valley was guarded now, not just by him and Mara, but by Sela's people, by the river, by the land itself. If trouble came, they'd face it together, as they always had. Years passed, and Najoni grew, her laughter a constant song in the valley. The lodge expanded, a second room added for her, its walls adorned with Mara's weavings and Amos's carvings. They lived simply, their days filled with work and love, their nights with stories by the fire. The scars of their past remained at Mara's wrists, Amos's shoulder. The memories neither spoke of, but they were no longer wounds. They were proof of what they'd survived, what they'd built. One autumn, as the cottonwoods turned gold, Sella rode to the lodge with news. Silas Boone had been found dead in Arizona, killed in a barroom brawl over a card game. The cavalry post had shifted focus, chasing new conflicts farther north. The wanted posters with Mara's face had faded, their ink washed away by time and rain. The valley, it seemed, had outlasted its hunters. That night, Amos and Mara sat by the river, Najoni asleep in the lodge. The stars were bright, the air cool with the promise of winter. Mara leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "We made it," she said, her voice soft but sure. Amos kissed her forehead, his arm tightening around her. "We did," he said, "and we'll keep making it." Their life wasn't the kind written in history books, with grand battles or famous names. It was quieter, deeper, a love carved from dust and defiance. A family forged in the shadow of hate, but sustained by mercy. The river flowed on, peaceful and unending, carrying their story into the stars. We hope this story touched your heart, showing how love can bloom in the harshest of deserts, how mercy can outshine hate. If the weight of mercy moved you, share your thoughts below. What do you think about the violence and injustice Mara and Amos faced? Was their fight for freedom worth the cost? Do you believe mercy can heal the wounds of a divided world, or does hate always leave a mark? Take a stand, share your perspective, and let's keep this conversation alive. Your voice matters. Comment now and join the discussion.